Women made history on Tuesday night at the State of the Union address. Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi stood proudly behind President Joe Biden as he declared the State of the Union is strong. Never in the history of this country have two women held the number 2 and 3 spots in our U.S. government. We celebrate this achievement and the trailblazing work of women during this month because this is Women's History Month. But also during this month, we reflect on the barriers that women still face to achieving parity in the workplace and beyond. We're asking the question today, in a society, particularly the United States, where 51% of its residents are women, why in 2022 are we, women, still fighting for our equal rights? All coming up next.
Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
History texts and classes are often dominated by male figures, yet women have played and continue to play a major role in the world's economy, politics, culture, and discoveries. And because of that, we deserve our fair share of recognition as well. Given Women's History Month, there is no better time to celebrate the contributions of women. But women are often referred to as the weaker sex. And as it turns out, we're not so weak after all. In fact, we are strong, vibrant, and brilliant. And here are some facts to prove it. Over 60% of college degrees awarded every year in the United States are earned by women. The 2 highest IQs ever recorded both belong to women. The world's first novel was published in Japan by a female author in AD 1000. Edith Wharton was the first woman to receive a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And the list goes on and on and on. And if, women are so smart, which those statistics I just gave you bear that out, why are our media portrayals often just the opposite? And why are women still paid less than men in corporations and in sports? We're going to be talking about all of that today because we want to celebrate women, but we also want to reflect on these barriers. My first guest today is Dr. Nadia Brown. She is a professor and chair of Women's and Gender Studies at Georgetown. She's a returning guest to the Special Report. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Women's History Month, Dr. Brown, no better time to celebrate the achievements of women, but also to reflect on these barriers that women continue to face. And you being a professor at a prestigious university, being a chair of a Women's and Gender Studies department, I want to ask you about how the history of women is taught in colleges versus the history of men.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Unfortunately, even in 2022, most of the students in our classes in Women and Gender Studies report that this is the first time that they're getting a complete and complex understanding of women, they're not getting that in their economics courses, in their political science courses, in their psychology courses, right? So the contributions that women continue to make, they're getting it in programs from classes like mine, not well integrated as well as it should be in mainstream disciplines.
And it's kind of interesting because we have to have a whole department called Women and Gender Study, because obviously the history of women isn't being taught, as you said, in those other departments, whether it's economics or, U.S. history or European history. Are you seeing any changes? Is anything happening at the academic level that's starting to even the playing field in terms of the way history is being taught?
Well, I am heartened that programs like mine are in the university, right? Because we are reminding not just the students of the importance of taking courses like this, but the university itself, right? And so we are demanding that the university include the scholarship on and about and by marginalized groups that have oftentimes been pushed outside. So it's really holding up the reflexive mirror to the university to say the university was once a space only for white men, wealthy white men, and we have protested many of these area studies, whether it's women's studies, Chicano studies, Black studies, to be included. And it's not just, again, like the material, but it's faculty, right? People that look like me that would have been excluded from a university job in the past.
And it's interesting. I started the show by giving some of those statistics that most people don't know about women. But when you look at the statistics around education, that women are the most educated demographic in the country, and that equally applies to Black women.
Right.
Why do you think we're still portrayed in the media as the weaker sex, as somehow not being able to cut it in tough jobs, whether it's government or the private sector?
Right. Yeah, I think it's gender socialization. So think about, how we teach our young boys and girls and non-binary children about roles that they can aspire to be, or what is appropriate behavior, right? So what is ladylike? What is masculine, right? These things have implications for how we as adults groom our children to grow up into what they believe they can or cannot do. And we reify it in all sorts of places, right? So the media is just one place where little children can look up and say, this is something that is open to me, something that I can do or shouldn't do, and this is how I should look, or this is how I should behave. But this also, again, right, it just really underscores how we as a society want to govern ourselves in these very gendered norms, that there's been some movement, but clearly not enough.
Yeah, and we see this challenging of women's intellect and our ability happen pretty much every day. It gets played out in the media. I'm reminded of this social media post around Tucker Carlson, where he, on his very popular Fox News program, demanded to see the LSAT score for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson as she moves forward with her nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. And being a lawyer, for many, many years, no one's ever asked me, and I've worked at some of the top law firms in this country, no one's ever asked me for my LSAT score, and most people don't even know what it is. And we know it's performative on the part of Tucker Carlson, right? So I don't want to place too much emphasis on this, but it is, I think, reflective of a bigger issue.
Oh, yes. You've hit the nail on the head here, right? It's meritocracy. It's this idea, in particular, right, that Black women don't belong, that they've gotten to this position because they didn't earn it. And so asking to see this LSAT score in some way will show that this woman did or did not deserve to get into Harvard. But really, that point is mute now, right? She is a Harvard-educated lawyer, has graduated, has been confirmed 3 times by the Senate. So asking for the LSAT score is like, again, right, it's like asking for Obama's birth certificate, right? We've already passed all of these things. This person has been duly noted as someone who is qualified, should be able to serve on the nation's highest court. And now we're asking to look back at this LSAT score. It is unfathomable, right? And I take this as a warning sign that the conservatives and those in Congress don't actually have an argument against Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, right? If they're digging up an LSAT score, they can't go on her record, right? They can't look at the things that she has done since she served on the bench. This is really playing in the mud, right? This is beneath most high-minded people. But I'm not surprised, like you mentioned, right? This was on the Tucker Carlson show. But if this is any indication of how conservatives are planning to they kind of govern themselves during the nomination process, I think some of us, progressives, Democrats, people that are champions of Black women in all spaces, should be patting ourselves on the back right now, right? Biden made an excellent choice. They can't come at her. They have nothing of substance. And so this should be on March 21st, at the start of this nomination, should be a very easy walk in the park for Judge KJB.
Yeah, for those people that may think that there's something to this LSAT request, let me just put it to rest. The woman got into Harvard, and by definition, she had to have a very high LSAT score. And even beyond getting into Harvard, she was on the Harvard Law Review, which is, so let's say Harvard is reserved for the top 1% of all students, Harvard Law School. Then you got to cut that percentage in half 20 times to become a member of the Harvard Law Review. I mean, it's the most prestigious of prestigious groups on the planet. So, but we didn't see that kind of request, right? When you think about George Bush, you think about Donald Trump as students in college, right? Neither of them having anywhere near the academic credentials that Judge Brown Jackson have. Reports that both of them were pretty mediocre, if not poor students, right? So we know that there is a record of these white men having achieved at the highest level, yet not having anywhere near the kind of academic credentials she has, which brings me to my next topic, which is this academic success that women have achieved. It doesn't seem to translate, because when you look at the recent headline about women CEOs, a record number 41, only 2 Black on this list, but the record number of 41 Fortune 500 companies. So if education is supposed to be the ticket to these higher positions, why aren't we seeing the translation? Why aren't those 60% of women that are getting these college degrees and graduate degrees, why aren't more of them ending up in C-suites as the CEO, as the COO of major corporations?
So research points us to 3 very concrete reasons. The first, probably not surprising to you or your listeners, is discrimination, right? So that there is still deep-seated racism and sexism, and women, particularly women of color, have different opportunities open to them, regardless of their qualifications, their background, and their experiences, right? There's just this idea that they can't cut it. Again, back to this conversation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. The second part is that when women even do have the education, they are funneled into pink labor, pink collar jobs, right? So they are jobs that are often feminized. They are seen to be lower skilled. In actuality, many of them are not. Think of teachers, think of nurses, right? Jobs that really hold the glue to our society together, childcare workers. And these happen to be most jobs that women and women of color still work. The other thing is that women, and very true for women of color, work less hours. And that is due to, right, other care and responsibilities, childcare, elder care. And so if the average American is working about 45 hours a week, women of color in particular are working less hours because they're doing so many other caregiving roles. Mm-hmm. So tap that on top of just, our average everyday American woman worker, right? And then to that exceptional few that you mentioned on the onset, right? Those that are CEOs that are making it to the C-suite. It's a lot smaller pool of people to choose from, right? To say that you should be elevated to this next position through a promotion. The pipeline just isn't there. And it's for those 3 reasons that researchers have identified.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's also a new report out that female doctors make $2 million less than male doctors over the arc of their career. So you think about all that it takes to go to medical school, 10 years that the people study from undergraduate to graduate school to residency, all the sacrifices that women and men make, only for the women to make $2 million. I mean, it's a huge
difference, right?
That's enormous.
And it's not just that, right? So it's the pay gap. This enormous pay gap that you mentioned, but also we know that Black women are burdened with the largest amount of student loan debt, right? That prohibits them from accruing generational wealth, from buying a home, from doing all the things to build equity. And so they're paying back these student loan payments that are making $2 million less, right? It's just it's an unequal playing field. And this is really a time for Congress to act, right? So it's people that are making high earners like doctors, and it's people who are low skilled workers or low wage earners that need this the most. And if Congress doesn't act by passing the Fairness Paycheck Act, which I argue they should do so immediately, particularly while Congress is still closely divided under Democratic control, that they will not have a chance to do so if the House flips in 2022. But now is it's a real prime time to address some of the inequities that women, and particularly women of color, face. And it's not just the Paycheck Act, but it's also doing these other kind of scaffolding things, like making childcare more accessible, trying to get more money back into the pockets of women workers by doing things like strengthening protections around childcare, trying to curb down inflation, right? Where we know that women of color are spending an exorbitant amount of money that they don't have on inflation issues like gas or bread, milk, right? These
absolutely. The child tax credit, free
Yes.
universal preschool, subsidies for childcare are all things we know will help make it easier for women to stay in the workplace longer and to, start to climb the ladder in a way that we see men have been able to do, unburdened by those realities that women shoulder. Just quickly before I let you go, Dr. Brown, we know women have made a lot of firsts. First African-American female vice president. So we're going to get the first African-American female on the Federal Reserve Board. That's moving forward. So there are a lot of areas where women are making first. Is there some area, segment of our economy where women have not broken into yet? We know we have firefighters and police officers and astronauts, but there's some area that has yet to be broken into by women?
I'm not necessarily thinking about places that women haven't broken into, because like you mentioned, right, we're still doing first, and those are important. But the part that I'm most concerned about is, why are we still celebrating these firsts? Why are we still having these firsts in 2022? And for me, that points back to the institutions and structures that enable discriminatory practices to go on unembedded, to not be checked. And so I would ask us, like, why do we get so excited about celebrating the first without looking back and saying, wait a minute, why is this a first, right? And what are the issues that have caused this? So I'm all on board, and I tell this to my students, right? Like, we should be celebrating Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, right? And we are doing so. But the larger question is, why did it take so long? Right? And what are the implications for American politics? What are the implications for American society when we don't have these voices, when we don't have people who are doing this work because of their race, their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation? That's the larger question. So I'll leave that with you, and hopefully your viewers and your other panelists will be able to pick this up. But I would really love for us to think about the other question, right? Like, why is this? And it's an indictment on American politics and the American society in general.
Yeah, I love that question. Why is this the first? We're celebrating it, and we're happy to see Judge Brown Jackson move forward. But definitely, when you think of the 200 years of the United States Supreme Court and the white men that have dominated that court, and the few women, and obviously no African-American woman, that's the question. Why is it taking us so long to get to parity? Particularly, as I said in the opening, 51% of this country are women. So
Right.
we are the majority, and we should be, many more of us should be in those spaces and places that we've talked about. Always a pleasure to see you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. All right, my next guest is Christian Nunes. She is the CEO of NOW, and NOW is the National Organization of Women, one of the nation's largest and most prestigious organizations working on behalf of women, women's rights, and equality. Good morning. Welcome back to the show, Christian.
Good morning, Areva. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Christian, NOW was a part of this big march that took place in January to urge Congress to pass the ERA. And we are still in 2022 talking about passing the Equal Rights Amendment. So can you just give us a brief history of what the ERA is, and why is it so important to get it passed?
Sure. Equal Rights Amendment is an amendment that should be the 28th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which basically it protects women. It gives them equal rights for protection for the sex class, or they would have equal rights for protections under the law. So they are protected from any sex discrimination. It will guarantee equal pay. It will guarantee protections for any sex discrimination in the workplace. A lot of the things that we're fighting for every day, from family medical leave work, parent leave, to discrimination, harassment in the workplace, to discriminate or decrease the gender pay gap. All these things would be available to us if there was the Equal Rights Amendment enshrined in the Constitution. But back when the forefathers first originated the U.S. Constitution, they intentionally left out women because women weren't considered whole. So a big part of the Equal Rights Amendment being enshrined into the Constitution would right those wrongs that were originally took place back when the Constitution was first formed.
So I know the amendment has been around since the 1920s. It picked up steam in the Civil Rights era. It was sent to the states for ratification in 1972 with a 7-year deadline. That deadline was extended to 1982. And then there was just recently a resolution passed in the House to basically do away with the deadline for ratification. But the amendment now has been caught up in this whole legal battle about the state's ratification and the deadline. Can you explain what's going on in the courts right now with the amendment?
Sure. So with the extensions, there were certain parts that had to take place, and that was the 38 states had to ratify the amendment in their states, and there was the Congress had to be able to also take place to ratify it, pass it, and there had to be a 2-year from the 38 state 2 years afterward that there was a guarantee that the Equal Rights Amendment would be enshrined into the Constitution. Well, now we're hearing that certain states are wanting to pull out. What the changes in our within our legislature and state legislature and our Congress, we're seeing that some states extremists are starting to want to pull out. Some people don't believe that we need it. They don't believe that women need these protections. Some people believe we already have these protections, but that is not true. So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that is happening regarding Equal Rights Amendment and what that does. And one of the things I really want to point out is by not having these protections, it is directly impacting marginalized communities, BIPOC communities, women, and those who most need these protections. And so it's just another way for certain groups to continue to oppress women who are most directly impacted by not having protections under the law. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing states, West Virginia, and particularly Virginia, wanting to pull out of the lawsuit where we're trying to make sure that we're forcing publication of the ERA into the U.S. Constitution. And so Virginia, Nevada, and Illinois are the last 3 states who went forth with enshrining and ratifying the ERA into their personal state legislators, which helped us get to the 38 states. So by Virginia pulling out, then what it looks like is like, okay, well, they're saying no longer we didn't want to be part of this. However, Illinois and Nevada are still moving forward with the lawsuit, saying we've already met the requirements. We can't go back. They're going to move forward with the archivists to make sure that we continue because they owe it to the people and to our women and to make sure this is enshrined to protect the citizens and make sure everyone's equal in this country. So they're going to move forward with this. We're not going to back down. Once it is enshrined, you can't now say, I retract, I no longer want it. We have to move forward with it. And all activists and advocates are going to make sure that it continues to move forward, as well as calling for the removal of the OLC memo of 2020 that was put in place.
So just to be clear, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia came on board 2017, 2018. They were the last 3 states that were needed for full ratification that would have allowed the amendment to become enshrined in the Constitution as the 28th Amendment. The Virginia now has pulled out because there's basically a lower court judge said that the deadline had been missed. An appeal has been filed to the DC Circuit Court of Appeal. Virginia was originally a part of that appeal. They've now pulled out, saying they're no longer in support of pushing forward to argue that the deadline had not been missed. The House passed the resolution doing away with the deadline. Did that resolution in the House move over to the Senate? Because I know Senate former leader Mitch McConnell is opposed to the ERA. So what did the Senate do when that resolution from the House went over to the Senate?
Yeah, so there is the Res SJ1, which is the resolution in the Senate to remove the deadline from the ERA. That is in the Senate, and it has bipartisan support. And I do want to say overwhelmingly, the removal of the deadline to make sure that ERA is ratified has overwhelmingly bipartisan support. 80% of people support the ERA being, the 28th Amendment being added to the Constitution and enshrined into the Constitution. So there is no reason why it is being stalled and held up, besides the basic reason we continue going into why we're still talking about this 99 years since originally it was introduced to us back in, in New York, Seneca Falls, right, is that people continue, and what we also seen about our voting rights and reproductive rights is that people continue wanting to control women, right? This is what we're getting down to, is that if we say women are equal under the law, which is the Equal Rights Constitution is saying, amendment is saying, then we have to make sure we're protecting women. Why would we not want to protect women? Why would we not want to protect our daughters and our mothers and our aunts and children and out there? There's no logical reason for it besides wanting to continue to oppress.
Yeah,
so
I was reading some of the opposition. One of the congressmen from Wisconsin, he argued, oh, this amendment is actually going to hurt women, because if it's passed, women will have to pay the same amounts for auto and health insurance rates as men. So we're seeing those kind of illogical, ridiculous arguments. What are some of the other arguments that you're hearing from those Republicans who are opposing? Because I know the resolution passed in the House, but there was only one Republican vote for the resolution with all the Democrats that voted for it. So what are some of the Republican arguments against passage?
I think the biggest one is a disinformation that it's not needed because it already exists. I think this is the biggest disinformation that we're seeing is that it's not needed and it's already existing in the Constitution, which is not true. I guarantee you women would not be spending the last 100 years of their lives advocating and fighting for a constitution that's already in place. So there is definitely need. And what also happens is that when we look at, cases of discrimination or inequality, there are loopholes that can take place because we do not have the 28th Amendment in this Constitution, because it's not written into it. We can always argue. So we have to look at how this really directly impacts women on so many different levels. We look at, domestic violence cases. We look at sexual assault cases. We look at, these different cases that directly impact women. When we go to argue these cases, we cannot use sex discrimination as a factor to look at how it impacts women directly. So, we have to continue pushing back on this, is that while we need this, is so crucial to making sure women are safe, women are equal, women are able to fight for the things that are important to them, we still have major gender wage pay gaps, right? Because we cannot even argue that when we have a job that people cannot go into it and say, well, this is a man's wage, right? Or men deserve to pay more because they're able to complete a job better. We can't even fully argue. People can still just go into an interview and say, oh, well, I'm going to pay this man more because I feel like he has more experience. That should not be existing, but that still exists, so we have to continue to, we're continually advocating for it, but I think that's the biggest misinformation we're seeing is that we don't need it.
So the argument is we already have enough laws on the books that protect women. And of course, a lot of men already say, women are already equal. What are you complaining about? We see you in the workplace. We see you in every, occupation in the country. So there is this misconception that somehow women have parity and have equity. But I'm glad you pointed out that wage disparity is still very much an issue.
Huge wage disparity. Women may be in the same job, but they would have to work 200 and so many days longer to even get the same wage that man has already worked. And that's only for white women. And if you add in Black women or Indigenous or Native American women or Latino women or Latina women, you're even working longer to even get to the same place. And that would cover childcare, that would cover home expenses, that would be able to buy a new home. So we're not even looking at the huge impact it has for just wage, or being able to fight for cases or being able to protect yourself and your family. So, or even Family Medical Leave Act, why are we one of the most industrialized countries who have so many great innovations, but we still can't even provide paid Family Medical Leave Act, because we typically see a paid Family Medical Leave Act as a benefit for the women, so we don't value it. Right. So we have to look at how our country takes our values and where we put our benefits in, what benefits we associate with women versus what we associate with men, and where we put our funding and what we pass and what we don't pass. But if we had the Equal Rights Amendment, that would totally change, because then we'd be looking at things more on a parity level.
So where do we go from here, Christian? We know the lawsuit, the appeals is at the DC Circuit Court level, yet to be decided. I assume this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Hopefully, Judge Brown Jackson will be on that court before it makes its way to the court. What else can women do at this point? Obviously, continue to support the organization and the movement to ratify the 28th Amendment, but on a grassroots level, what do you implore women to do?
Well, I think there's two things, on the January 27th, the date, that 2-year anniversary for when we have met all the requirements for the Equal Rights Amendment to be enshrined, President Biden said clearly that he supported the Equal Rights Amendment and it being enshrined into the Constitution. And I think this is a place where we really want to hold President Biden, accountable for helping us get this through. Like everything he can do in his administrative powers to help us get through enshrining the Constitution, we want to ask him to do for us on this powers. I mean, he is standing with two of the highest power women behind him in his administration. He has helped, he's also working to get Ketanji onto the Supreme Court. So we know that he stands for women. And we know that he has demonstrated that he believes in the power of women. He has demonstrated that in his administration, right? So we also need to ask, President Biden to do everything he can in his administrative powers to also make sure the 28th Amendment is enshrined in the Constitution. That's one. And then two, we want to also continue to get our advocates and our grassroots coalitions and our organizations and even our corporations to find out ways that they can support and put pressure on our Congress who have the authority to pass this, that they need to do everything in their power to put bipartisan pressure on our Congress to put this over the edge and pass this and make sure that the resolution gets passed in the Senate.
Thank you so much, Christian, for your insights and helping us understand what the status of the 28th Amendment is. I don't think many people think about it. It's not getting nearly the attention that it deserves, particularly during Women's History Month. We should be lifting up this issue and the importance of getting this amendment ratified in the Constitution and the role that we as women and men, as you said, this isn't just about women. Men have mothers and daughters and sisters, so this is a universal issue for men and women, and we all need to be talking about it and taking actions to encourage our elected officials to act in a way that's going to provide parity and equity for women. Thank you for your voice and your leadership on this issue.
Thank you so much.
All right. Nowhere is the inequality between men and women more glaring. Well, I don't know. I just gave you that CEO statistics. That's pretty glaring. That physician pay statistic is pretty glaring. But also when you think about women in sports, the disparities are so glaring. Women in sports have been fighting for parity for decades. And even after the passage of some significant federal statutes, that fight continues. Here for this part of our conversation is Dr. Joan Steidinger. She is a sports psychologist and she's the author of a book, Stand Up and Shout Out, Women's Fight for Equality in Sports. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Steidinger. You have devoted pretty much your entire career on working on these issues. Now you've written this book about sports and the issues of women inequality. Tell us that you identify in your book 3 areas where women suffer the most in terms of sports. Share with us what those 3 areas are. I think you need to unmute, Doctor. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Leadership, media, and pay. And one of the things that's very striking, you were giving statistics about the Fortune 500 companies. Well, when you look at athletic editors in this country, 89% of them are white males. So that not only do white males take it over, they don't have BIPOC men, let alone women.
And these are editors who are writing about sports, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there's one website called The Athletic that is a recent addition to the internet. And they wrote in their introduction to themselves, we are the sports channel that will feature all sports, except they don't feature any women's sports. And when Cheryl Reeve, a major coach and GM in the WNBA, confronted them on this issue, what they did is they said, well, when you win a game or you do really well, then maybe we'll put you up. So we're still getting brushed off in sports. In fact, since Title IX, one of the things that's happened is that participation for girls in sports has vastly increased, vastly. However, coaches of women's sports, when it first came out, was like at 92%. Now, women coaching women's teams, that meant 92% were coaching women's teams. And now the amount of women coaching women's teams is only 41%. And it's not getting better. It's stagnated.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation Dr. Ketra Armstrong, because you mentioned what's happening around Title IX. And Professor Armstrong is a professor of sports management, and she's the director of equity and inclusion at the University of Michigan. So she's at a major university that's grappling with this issue of women in sports. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Dr. Armstrong. Help us understand what Title IX was intended to do and what you see the reality is of Title IX, particularly at a big university like the University of Michigan.
Title IX was intended to provide equitable opportunities for girls and women in sports. And while it was well intended, there were some unintended consequences. As the doctor mentioned previously, one of the unintended consequences was that it eliminated many of the leadership opportunities for women. And it also changed the model of sports. When men and women were separate, when she talked about Title IX and 90+% of the women were in charge of women's programs, it was a different type of game. It was about participation.
Men were in charge of women's programs.
No, women were in charge. Prior to Title IX, women were in charge of women's sports, and they managed it in a way that was about participation. It wasn't just about winning and commercialization, and it was about the growth and development of women. When Title IX, consequent to Title IX, when programs merged, because that was the way of providing equality, what we saw was a loss of women in leadership. And we saw more men just taking control of women as coaches, as athletic directors, in the media, etc. So an unintended consequence was the loss of opportunities for women at the leadership level, but participation blossomed. So that was positive. It did increase the participation opportunities for girls and women, but it came at the cost of their leadership, women's leadership. And so that was one of the unintended consequences of Title IX. And it's a consequence that we're still trying to address.
So I want to talk about some specific examples of this that are really glaring. And let's focus on the NCAA. And the disparities of the men's and the women's basketball programs was brought to light in the 2021 NCAA basketball tournaments when one of the female players went on social media and made this incredible video showing the disparities in the locker rooms, showing the little tiny weight set that was available for women versus this massive weight room and facility that had been set up for men, and really shining a bright light on that. Now, obviously, this was not new, Dr. Steidinger, this disparity, but it was this video, this TikTok video that went viral that showed it to the world. How have teams been allowed to do this, to have such disparities in how they provide even training facilities for women versus men?
Well, I don't think it's been pointed out, the disparities, quite like the Final Four was last year. And I think what the topic of my book, or the title of my book, Stand Up and Shout Out, this is what women need to do. And particularly, I think BIPOC women need to do, because they struggle way more than white women to be in leadership and to be respected and treated equally well, particularly when you look at somebody like the Williams sisters, for instance, to get away from the WNBA for a second. The Williams sisters, phenomenal athletes, incredible role models. In fact, Venus was in charge of getting equal pay at Wimbledon for women along with men. She's not highly valued. And then when you look at like this summer's Olympics, I'm sorry I'm jumping off of the WNBA, but I think there's some important examples we need to talk about. When Allison Felix won her 2 medals and became the most decorated track and field Olympian, do you know what my local paper did? It had a picture of her about that big, and then they had a picture of a guy who got a bronze, an African-American guy who got a bronze this big. I mean, she has 2 more medals than Carl Lewis. They don't make a big deal about it. In the most recent Olympics, if you look at somebody I've followed for years because she just has such a nice presence, is Elena Myers-Taylor. Elena Myers-Taylor has been a leader, and she's so humble, and she's actually a former president of the Women's Sports Foundation. She, at this Olympics now, is the most winningest Olympian in bobsled for the United States, and also the most winningest Black person in bobsled in the United States. And do you see anything being done about her? These things are huge deals. And the models that these gals could present, if they would only do something about them, it's exceedingly frustrating to me, and probably to you, Dr. Armstrong, to see them not taken care of effectively in terms of their accomplishments.
Yeah, that's great points, Doctor. And Dr. Armstrong, why is it that women like Allison Felix and the other African American women, and not just African American women, but women in sports who have accomplished so much, are not getting the kind of attention, the endorsements? Because let's talk about the attention. The attention drives endorsements as well, and we're not seeing that. Even in 2022.
Yeah, it's disheartening. It is disheartening. But listen, let's just be reminded that sport is a male domain. Sport is the place where boys become men. Sport is the place that celebrates masculinity. And so men have long tried to protect the boundaries of masculinity, and women have tried to find a place of belonging. And so women have been allowed to have a certain place, to be in the feminine sports. And even when they're in those rugged sports like hockey, there has to be what's called feminine cues present to still show that there's an element of femininity. So what women have been required to do in their own presentation to participate in sport is just so unfair on so many levels. But sport is a male domain. And so men can be mediocre, and we support them. Yeah. But women have to be stellar, outstanding, and have unprecedented feats just to get a little attention, because that's the culture. We're in a culture where our country has not fully celebrated women in sport, because the gender ideology that we've been socialized to, that, sports are for boys and men, and girls and women do the domestic and the soft things. It's hard to eradicate that culture that has been permeating for so long throughout the fiber, not just in sports, but we see it in every entity. So it's gender ideology that we haven't overcome yet. And so that's why even the best athletes have to be incredible just to get a modicum of attention. But that's the culture. What we're seeing now with soccer, we're seeing the community, we're seeing a generation, we're seeing boys and men saying, we must do better with women's soccer. And so it wasn't until we had a groundswell movement of not just the athletes saying, look at me, see me, hear me, but we had the young girls and mothers and fathers and the whole country's, understanding that this wrong has to be made right. So what we need, my point is a revolution. We need a social movement. And that has to come not just from the athletes, but it has to come from the community. It has to come from society at large. And that's what we're starting to see a little bit with women's soccer.
No, and great points about, yes, we definitely have to change that ideology. I was so struck by this, looking up the pay differentiation in the WNBA versus the NBA, that women on average who play professional basketball are making $130,000 as their base pay. And that's a big increase from where they were. And the average male that plays in the NBA salary, $7 million. And that women cap out around $500,000, have to go overseas to play a second season to basically, earn more money. So such really appalling disparity. But you published your book, Doctor, Stand Up and Shout Out, 2 years ago.
Yes.
Any progress that you can point to, and we're going to talk about that big soccer settlement, that $24 million settlement by the women's soccer team, but putting that aside, are there any other big things that have happened over these 2 years that you can point to that reflect some movement, some progress?
Well, I have to say the one thing that happened just before my book was released was that the WNBA salaries did go up, but they don't even begin to compare, as you said, with NBA. And with the soccer women, what's so, to me, important about this lawsuit and this supposed equal pay, and I say supposed it because what they're talking about is ratification of a contract they haven't yet completely negotiated. So they're saying it'll be equal to men and women, but I want to see it actually take place and happen. But I don't think in terms of pay issues, we're getting much better at all. In fact, I don't know if you're aware, but women's US hockey before the last Winter Olympics threatened to boycott the World Championships. And so what they did, the US Hockey Federation, they went around and tried to find girls in college and other girls to replace these players. And all the women said no. Mm. And so what ensued is then the men threatened to boycott the World Championships, and nothing happened. And then a bunch of professional teams supported the women's hockey, and nothing happened. And finally, 15 to 20 senators wrote a letter that said they should be paying them some amount of money, because I think they were like paying them like $1,700 a year. It was crazy. And only then did US Hockey make a shift. But I think what Dr. Armstrong said about the fact that we have this patriarchal society is so reflexive in things like when you look at all the socioeconomic factors for women in terms of equality, the United States ranks 50th. We think it's so great here, and it's not really like New Zealand in their media shows women's sports 15% of the time. And in the United States, it's 1 to 4% of the time. Wow. And a Nielsen study that was put out where it went to 8 different countries, asking if women and men were interested in women's sports. In every country overall, there were tons of men interested in women's sports. And sometimes in some places, more men than women were interested in seeing women's sports. And so part of the problem, at least with pro sports, is there's no promotional dollars spent. Somehow we don't warrant being advertised and promoted. And so all these men's sports, as Dr. Armstrong said, in terms of the patriarchy, all the men's sports, they spend millions of dollars promoting them. And so there's so many inequities when it comes to pay, because it's not just even direct pay. As you were talking about the NBA, it's also the fact there's not equal facilities, there's not equal travel. There's just so many things that just...
Yeah, it's funny that you raise it, because in the video, the TikTok video exposing the disparities in the NCAA, she also talked about the difference in the swag bags that the teams got. In the meal, she said even the women weren't even fed the same food that the men were given. But you raise a good point, Dr. Steidinger. So Dr. Armstrong, this issue of advertising women's sports, how frequently women's sports are portrayed in the media, the argument from men is that, well, women don't deserve to get paid equally because they don't generate the same level of enthusiasm, the same level of support, the same level of ticket sales. So if we are not making, the multi-billion-dollar contract on the WNBA team as we are on the NBA team, we shouldn't then be forced to pay women the same as we pay men. What do you make of that argument?
I think in some regard, there is some merit to that argument, because there is a notion of the market value. Right, there is and we understand we are still in a society where market still matters. So the market value and understanding that, But we also have to ask, but are we investing enough in women to allow them to have that type of product? Are we creating an entertainment value that would want sponsors to affix their name and their monies to it? And so it's not just looking at the end product, but the investment and how we positioned it, how we packaged it. And the disparities are enormous. From travel, like we just talked about, from travel, from the salaries, from the facilities, from nutrition, from uniforms, you name it. So you have a product that's treated like a second-class citizen in so many ways. And so it's not surprising that it does not generate the same following, with few exceptions. And that's soccer. It's interesting because soccer is one of those sports where that argument pales. When you say that the women's soccer team doesn't have a good enough product, the product is inferior to the men, when you look at the numbers, it pales. In fact, it's a fallacy to even think that. We know how successful the women's soccer team has been. So that argument no longer held, that women have an inferior product that we're not interested in. And so I think what we're seeing, though, is with women's soccer, it's such a model. It's showing how, when given an opportunity, women's sports can also matter. And so women's sports, there is a market value. It's a better product. And not only that, it's generating revenue in the monies that's coming in from merchandise sales, et cetera. But unfortunately, that's the exception. Too many women's sports can't boast those type of numbers. They can't boast that type of success. And it really allows that argument to prevail that women's sports is inferior to men's sports. But my contention is, yes, there is a market value, but we also have to look at how we're growing the market, how we're nurturing the players, how we're training the players, how we're socializing our country to celebrate women's sports like they do. And that's one of the reasons many of the women's basketball players in the WNBA, they go to other countries because they pay more money because those countries celebrate them and they don't mind seeing women being empowered in sport. We're not fully there here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting because the lawsuit that was settled by the U.S. Federation of Soccer, they settled this lawsuit even though in court, the women lost the lawsuit. They lost on the biggest issue of equal pay. The judge ruled against the women. And rarely in a lawsuit, when you lose on your biggest issue, is the other party willing to come to the table and offer settlement dollars. And I hear what you're saying, Dr. Steidinger, that it hasn't been resolved yet because we don't know what this contract is going to look like when it ultimately is negotiated and if those salaries are going to reach parity. So there's still lots of work to be done. But let's talk about tennis, though, because we do know that's another sport where women, starting with Billie Jean King and others, and obviously the Williams sisters that you bring up, Dr. Steidinger, have transformed tennis. And women in tennis are as big of a draw. And we know when the Williams sisters were at their peak, they were one of the biggest draws in the world of tennis. And obviously they fought, as you said, Venus did, to get equal pay in some of those tournaments. But even Serena today, I don't know if you all saw the mix up with the New York Times, writes a big article about Serena getting a $111 million investment in her venture fund firm that she has started to support tech firms. And they put a picture of Venus, even though this is Serena's company. And this big news is about Serena and her investment firm that now has a $111 million investment that was just made into it. And she had to call them out. She had to say, look, New York Times, do better. You know that's not me, that's my sister. And we've been around long enough. You guys should know the difference. Papers make mistakes. They're not perfect, right? So maybe it was an honest mistake, but it does, I think, speak to even when women get to the level of the Williams sisters, there still is this lack of recognition for their worth.
Yeah, it's like when I talked about Allison Felix and Lana Myers Taylor. They don't get the recognition they deserve, and yet what's happening is the reason now. I think what happens now is what the WNBA did was a very smart thing, like the Williams sisters did. They spoke up. They called them out. And I think like the great thing about Serena and Venus, particularly Serena though, And she speaks up and she tells it like it is. And she's very direct. And I think women too much try to be nice. And the thing I really love a lot about BIPOC African American women in particular is they say it like it is. And that needs to happen more in sports and more in sports to call out the inequities and really point these things out. I mean, if you say, like, the soccer team didn't earn as much as the men's, the last World Cup, you know, the men's soccer didn't even make it in the World Cup, as you probably know. And in the women's World Cup, they said they were going to up their pay for the people who won. Yeah, they upped it from 1 million to 2 million. And the winner of the men's soccer makes 38 million. And so the men's team that isn't even comparable to our women's team in terms of soccer, when they were in the World Cup, they came in ninth. It came in, I think it was ninth, seventh or ninth, and they earned 9 million. So how can you even compare, you know, who's making what when everything is so unequal? I think soccer is an area that's horribly misogynistic. I said so in my book, and someone didn't really like it who had endorsed my book, but you got to tell it like it is, you know? And I think organizations like FIFA and like the International Runners Association and all their freaking prejudice against Caster Semenya, these are organizations that are still, as Dr. Armstrong pointed out, they're still really misogynistic. They still don't actually value the women. And when women make statements in their sports, a lot of times they don't get recognized. However, I used to be a competitive ultra runner. And one of the things that's happening in ultra running now is in longer races, like 300, 400, 500 miles, women are beating men outright by like 12 hours, 15 hours.
Wow.
And they are getting some recognition within that community, because I found in that community initially in the 90s, of course, when I entered it, there was a lot more of this kind of like, who are you? And now they're appreciating fast women runners.
Right.
But, you know, they're not getting paid anything for the most part, unless they might have a shoe sponsorship or something like that. And I think the pay issue is really indicative of how we respect people.
Yeah.
Particularly
So it's a statement of our priorities and our values, right? What we pay. Dr. Armstrong, any final words? Women's History Month. We are celebrating women, but we're also reflecting on the barriers and the structural racist and gender biased barriers that are preventing women across the board, not just in sports, from achieving parity. Any final thoughts on what we all can do this month to push forward on these issues?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I want to encourage everyone to support girls and women's sports. Go out to the local team, the college, high school, whatever it is, and get girls in, take them to games, let them, we say this all the time, we can't be what we can't see. Take girls to the game, let them see a vision of inspiration of what they can do and who they can be. But I also don't want us to lose sight on the power of sport as an agent for social change. In 1973, when Billie Jean King played Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes, because Bobby Riggs had this idea that any man could beat the best women's player in the world. And it was an amazing exhibition, but Billie Jean King beat him, Long Beach's finest, Billie Jean King, 6'4", 6'3", 6'3". She dominated. That not only impacted women in sport, but girls and mothers all over within this girls empowerment revolution, because sport has such visibility. People can see the strides that girls and women are making. So one, let's not lose sight of the power of sport as an agent for social change, but all of us get out into the communities and support girls and women's sports. They need us. We need them. The world needs them. And that's how we can help.
Oh, great advice. And thank you for reminding us of that epic battle between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. That was almost 50 years ago. And she is definitely a pioneer in breaking barriers in women in sports. a great way to end this segment. Thank you, Dr. Steidinger. Your book, again, is Stand Up and Shout Out. Make sure you pick up a copy of it. Always a pleasure to see you, Dr. Armstrong. Always
Likewise.
great insights. All right, I want to thank all of my guests this morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us. This is Women's History Month, and we are celebrating, yes, we're celebrating the accomplishments of women, and there's so many amazing women. And they don't have to be women making historical moves like Kamala Harris or Judge Brown Jackson. There are so many amazing everyday women who are doing phenomenal things, taking care of our kids in daycare centers, teaching our kids in public schools, responding to health emergencies as medical technicians, paramedics, as doctors in hospitals, as nurses in hospitals, as police officers, as moms who are taking care of kids, as students, as women on campuses. So there are women all around us that we should be celebrating and uplifting during this month. So I want everyone to find a woman in their immediate circle, someone that they love, they care for, and tell them today how much you value them, how much you love them, how much you are happy to have them in your life, because oftentimes women feel underappreciated and taken for granted. And when we look at all these disparities that we face, from pay disparities, from media disparities, it can be overwhelming. It can be isolating, and it can be downright depressing at times. So during this Women's History Month, let's lift up the favorite woman in your life. And those are my words to live by. Lift up a woman in your life. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe out there. Wear your mask, maybe. And remember, we're all in this together.